The universe, by every measurable standard the Federation possessed, operated on principles of elegant consistency. Matter behaved according to known laws. Energy followed predictable pathways. Even the most exotic phenomena, wormholes, temporal anomalies, Borg transwarp conduits, could eventually be mapped, cataloged, and filed into the vast archive of scientific understanding that Starfleet had spent 2 centuries building. Lieutenant Commander, Data had once calculated the probability of a genuinely inexplicable event occurring within Federation space at approximately 0.000031%. Captain Jean-Luc Picard had long since stopped trusting that number. He was on the bridge of the Enterprise D when the anomaly appeared. It began as a subspace fluctuation, the kind that made junior science officers sit up straighter and senior officers set down their tea. Lieutenant Worf reported a gravitational distortion forming at coordinates 227 Mark 14, well within Federation territory, 3 light-years from the Vulcan system. The distortion was large, uncommonly large. Counselor Troi rose from her chair without being asked, her expression shifting into something Picard recognized immediately. Not fear, but profound, disorienting wonder. "Captain," she said quietly, "I'm sensing thousands of minds, all at once, and something underneath them, something I have no words for. It's warm, it's alive, but it isn't biological." The view screen told the rest of the story. Space tour. That was the only word for it. Not a clean aperture like a wormhole, not the shimmering geometry of a transwarp conduit, but a ragged, luminous wound in the fabric of reality, edged in light that shifted between gold and white and a blue so deep it registered on sensors as a new wavelength entirely. Through that wound came something impossible, a structure, a city, a temple the size of a small moon, ancient and magnificent, constructed from pale stone that gleamed as though lit from within, its towers reaching upward in architectural ambition that predated the Federation by millennia. It drifted into normal space with eerie slowness, trailing clouds of ionized particles that sparked against the Enterprise's forward sensors, like static electricity against bare skin. Worf's console erupted. "Captain, I am reading over 10,000 life signs aboard that structure. Humanoid, mostly, but with biological readings unlike anything in our database. There is also," he paused, which from Worf was the equivalent of a lesser man dropping his tricorder, "an energy field surrounding the entire structure. It is not electromagnetic. It is not gravitational. It does not correspond to any known force. Can you identify it?" "No, sir. Sensors cannot classify it. It simply is." Data turned from his station with the particular precision that indicated he was about to say something that would unsettle everyone present. "Captain, I am detecting trace quantum resonance signatures, consistent with an interdimensional transit event. Whatever this structure is, it did not originate in our universe. Furthermore, the energy field Lieutenant Worf references appears to be responsive. It reacted to our active sensor sweep. 0.003 seconds before the sweep reached the structure's outer boundary. The bridge fell silent except for the soft percussion of consoles and the ambient hum of the Enterprise's warp core thrumming 4 decks below. Picard stood. He straightened his uniform with the unhurried deliberateness of a man reminding himself of who he was before stepping into the unknown. He had faced the Borg. He had stood before Q. He had watched civilizations rise and dissolve within the span of a single mission. He understood, better than most, that the universe was not obligated to make sense on humanity's schedule. "Hail them," he said. The comm channel opened to static, not the static of equipment failure, but the static of a universal translator, working at absolute capacity and finding no foothold. Then something shifted. The static organized itself, not into language, but into intention, a felt sense of acknowledgement that bypassed the auditory centers entirely and arrived, somehow, as comprehension. Troi gasped softly. Even Data tilted his head at a precise 12-degree angle, the android equivalent of bewilderment. A voice came through, old, measured, carrying within it the specific gravity of someone who had spent a very long time learning when to speak and when to listen. "The Force brought us here. We did not choose this place, but we feel, in this moment, that it chose us. Picard kept his expression neutral through considerable effort. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets. You have arrived in our space, and we mean you no harm. Can you identify yourselves? A pause. The golden light on the view screen pulsed once, a single, slow breath of luminescence from the temple's highest spire. We are the Jedi. Order. We are what remains of the guardians of peace and justice in our galaxy. And we suspect, the voice continued, with something that might have been dry amusement, beneath its solemnity, that your galaxy has been waiting for us, longer than either of us knows. If you want to see more characters and civilizations enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a crossover you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Picard exchanged a look with Riker, who raised an eyebrow in the way that meant, well, here we go again. The captain clasped his hands behind his back and studied the ancient structure, filling his view screen. The impossible monument to an impossible order, hanging in Federation space like a question the universe had decided, unilaterally, that humanity needed to answer. Data, he said, begin a full spectral analysis. I want everything our sensors can tell us about that energy field. He paused. And give me a channel to Starfleet Command. We are going to need a great deal more than diplomatic protocols for this one. Behind him, Counselor Troy sat back down slowly, her eyes distant, her attention pulled toward something vast and ancient that her empathic senses could feel but not fully contain, like trying to hold an ocean in cupped hands. 10,000 minds. And beneath them, threading through all of them like a root system beneath a forest, something old beyond reckoning. Something that was not a technology, not a life form, not a phenomenon. Something that was simply, inexplicably, present. The Enterprise held position. The temple gleamed. And somewhere within its stone corridors, 10,000 beings who had lost everything, except their purpose, turned their attention, collectively, and without discussion, toward the small Federation starship that had been the first to answer. The Jedi. Temple's docking infrastructure was not designed for Federation shuttlecraft. It was not designed for any craft that didn't respond to the Force-sensitive guidance systems embedded in its landing bay floors, ancient mechanisms that read intention rather than transponder codes, that opened hangar doors when a pilot's mind was calm and closed them when it wasn't. Chief O'Brien spent 40 minutes trying to establish a transporter lock before Counselor Troy suggested, gently, that perhaps they should simply ask permission. They did. The doors opened. Picard led the away team personally over Riker's objections, which was itself a statement of how seriously he was taking this. With him came Troy, Data, and Worf, the combination of empathy, analytical precision, and martial credibility he considered most appropriate for first contact with an unknown civilization. They materialized in the shuttle bay and stepped into air that was different from the recycled, temperature-regulated atmosphere of a starship. It was warmer. It carried the faint scent of something ancient, stone and incense, and the particular stillness of a place that had absorbed 10,000 years of meditation. Worf's hand moved instinctively toward his disruptor before he stopped himself, nostrils flaring, processing the sensory data with the disciplined suspicion of a Klingon security officer who had learned, over years of serving with Picard, to let curiosity precede aggression. They were met by two figures. The first was tall, dark-skinned, with the close-cropped hair and deliberate stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with the weight he carried. He wore robes of deep burgundy and brown, and at his hip hung a cylindrical metal device that Data's tricorder immediately flagged as an energy weapon of unknown classification. His eyes assessed the away team with the speed and precision of a military commander and the depth of a philosopher, two modes of perception operating simultaneously, neither subordinating the other. The second was small, extraordinarily small, barely 90 centimeters tall, with large ears, green skin, and eyes that were simultaneously the oldest and most alert things Picard had ever seen in a face. He leaned on a gnarled walking stick, but the posture was not one of frailty. It was the posture of someone who had decided, centuries ago, that stillness was its own form of strength. Captain Picard, the tall man said. His voice matched the one from the comm channel, measured, carrying gravity without performing it. I am Mace Windu, senior member of the Jedi High Council. This is Grand Master Yoda. Picard inclined his head. Master Windu. Master Yoda. On behalf of the United Federation of Planets, I extend our welcome and our sincere wish to understand. What has happened to bring you here? Yoda's ears rose slightly. His eyes moved from Picard to Troy to Data to Worf, lingering on each with an attention that felt less like observation and more like reading. The way a scholar's eyes move across a text, pulling meaning from arrangement and spacing as much as from the words themselves. When his gaze reached Worf, something shifted in the old master's expression. Not alarm. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of a warrior's spirit wearing a warrior's face. Sense much in your crew? I do, Yoda said. His syntax was unusual, inverted in ways the universal translator rendered faithfully but couldn't fully explain. Conflict in the tall one. His eyes settled on Worf. Honor-bound, yet questioning. A warrior who wonders if his wars have been worthy. He shifted to Troy. And you? Feel us, can you? All of us. Troy met his gaze steadily. I sense your emotions, yes. All 10,000 of you, to some degree. She paused, choosing honesty over diplomacy, overwhelming. Like standing next to a son. Yoda nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he already knew. The Force. Unfamiliar with it, your people are. And yet, he paused, tilting his head. Present in this universe. It is ancient, untouched, like a garden that has grown wild for 10,000 years with no gardener to tend it. Data's tricorder was moving in a slow arc, and Picard noted that Mace Windu tracked it with calm interest rather than suspicion. Forgive me, Data said, addressing Windu directly. I am attempting to quantify the energy field surrounding your temple. My instruments detect it clearly but cannot classify it within any known framework. You refer to it as the Force. We do. Can you describe its mechanism? Its origin? The physical principles that govern it? Windu looked at Data for a long moment with an expression that wasn't condescension but genuine consideration. The look of a man deciding how to explain color to someone who had never seen light. The Force is an energy field generated by all living things. It binds the galaxy together. It can be felt, directed, used by those sensitive to it. Generated by living things, Data repeated. Biochemically, I am detecting unusual concentrations of midi-chlorians in your cellular structure, microscopic organisms present at extraordinary density. For the first time, Mace Windu's composure showed a hairline fracture of surprise. You've identified midi-chlorians. In 0.4 seconds of passive biological scanning, yes. I have 17 follow-up questions about their function, if you are willing. Windu glanced at Yoda. The ancient master made a sound that, processed through the universal translator, came out as something adjacent to a chuckle. Like this one, I do, he said. Picard stepped forward, gently redirecting the conversation toward the question that could not wait. Masters, I must ask directly, what happened to your order? You said you did not choose this place. What did you leave behind? The temperature in the hangar seemed to drop by 2 degrees. Windu's jaw set. Yoda's eyes, which had been warm with curiosity, became very still. A war, Windu said finally. A war we were losing. And your republic? Your government. Gone. The word landed like a weight dropped from a great height. The Senate. The Chancellor. The clone armies. All of it. In our universe, all of it is gone. Whether by destruction or transformation, we do not yet know. We know only that the Force created a pathway, and we walked through it. Because the alternative was annihilation. He paused. We are, Captain, the last of the Jedi. The shuttle bay held the silence for a moment that felt longer than it was. Picard thought of every refugee crisis the Federation had ever faced. He thought of the Bajorans after the Cardassian occupation. He thought of the way history had a habit of producing survivors, who carried within them both the seeds of renewal and the weight of everything lost. He thought of the Prime Directive, and then he thought of the 10,000 minds Troy had described, a sun's worth of awareness, adrift in a foreign universe, carrying the last ember of a civilization. Then, he said carefully, let us begin by ensuring you are safe. The Federation has protocols for Captain. Windu's voice was quiet but absolute. "We appreciate your protocols, but understand something clearly." He straightened to his full height, and something in the air around him shifted, in a way that Picard's senses registered without his instruments explaining. "We are not refugees seeking asylum. We are the Jedi Order. We do not require management. We require understanding. There is a significant difference." Picard held the man's gaze. He recognized, in Mace Windu's eyes, the particular dignity of someone who had suffered enormously and refused to let that suffering become subordination. "Understood," Picard said, and he meant it. Yoda's ears rose again, and this time there was no ambiguity about the expression on his ancient face. It was approval, quiet, measured, and, Picard suspected, genuinely rare. Dr. Beverly Crusher had seen a great many things in her career that defied straightforward medical explanation. She had treated officers who had been partially phased into bulkheads, colleagues who had returned from the dead via alien intervention, and, on one memorable occasion, a patient whose entire cellular structure had been temporarily rewritten by a rogue holodeck program. She considered herself, professionally speaking, difficult to rattle. She was rattled. The Jedi healer who stood across the examination table from her in sickbay was named Vokarache, a Twi'lek woman whose headtails moved with subtle expressiveness, conveying emotional nuance the way a human's hands might. She had arrived aboard the Enterprise at Picard's invitation, part of a small delegation sent to establish what Windu had called a foundation of mutual comprehension. She was calm, precise, and currently watching Beverly's medical tricorder with the politely restrained amusement of someone watching a child use a spoon to dig a well. "Your instrument," Chase said, in the measured standard that the Universal Translator had rapidly optimized for, "is reading midi-chlorian concentrations correctly, but it is interpreting them as a pathology. A parasitic infection, perhaps?" "That's exactly what it flagged," Beverly admitted. "Unusually high concentrations of intracellular organisms. Our initial assumption was contamination of some kind. They are not contaminants. They are symbiotic. More than symbiotic, they are the biological bridge between living tissue and the force. The higher the concentration, the greater the potential for force sensitivity." Che tilted her head. "Though sensitivity is only potential, discipline is what matters." Beverly set down the tricorder and looked at the woman directly. "So the force, this energy field, it's mediated through biology? Through these organisms?" "Partially. The relationship is more recursive than that. The force generates midi-chlorians. Midi-chlorians enable perception of the force. Living beings generate the force through the fact of their existence. It is," Che paused. "Yes, the whole exceeds the sum of its parts by a factor I cannot currently calculate. This is unusual. Most energy phenomena in our universe scale predictably." He paused. "There is also the question of directionality. The force field is not isotropic. It has preferences, orientations. It responds differently to different stimuli in ways that suggest something closer to volition than physics." Balaba was quiet for a moment. "You are describing, in the language of science, what we call the will of the force. I am describing an anomaly that my instruments can detect but cannot explain." Data looked up. "I find the distinction important." "As do we," she said, and there was warmth in it. "The Jedi do not require the force to be explicable. We require it to be listened to. Perhaps that is a difference in methodology rather than conclusion." Data considered this with the full processing power of a positronic brain. "That is," he said finally, "a more sophisticated epistemological position than I initially anticipated." The real confrontation, however, was happening in the observation lounge. Picard had convened a senior staff meeting, the kind that happened when the situation exceeded the capacity of any single department to contain it. Around the table sat Riker, Troy, Worf, Data Viacom panel, LaForge, and Guinan, who had arrived without being summoned, and taken a seat at the far end of the table with the air of someone who had been waiting for this particular meeting for a very long time. The question on the table was deceptively simple. "What do the Jedi want?" "They've been here 6 hours," Riker said, "and they've already mapped every major power system on this ship through what Counselor Troy describes as passive force sensitivity. They know our crew complement our weapon systems, and our warp capability, not because they scanned us, but because they felt us. He leaned forward. That's not a refugee situation. That's an intelligence operation. I don't believe it's intentional, Troy said carefully. What I'm sensing from the council members is genuine disorientation. They're in an unfamiliar universe, cut off from everything they knew. But their perceptions are, they can't turn them off. Sensing the ship's systems, the crew's emotional states, the structural integrity of the hull, for a Jedi Master. That's like asking you not to see what's in front of you. The Force acts as a passive sensor array, data confirmed over the comm. One of extraordinary resolution and range. Master Balaba was aware of a plasma coolant microleak in Jeffrey's tube. 17 Alpha approximately 4 minutes before our own sensors flagged it. She mentioned it conversationally. LaForge shook his head slowly. They can feel the ship. They can feel everything, Troy said. The ship, the crew, the space around us. Master Yoda, when I tried to sense him empathically, it was like reaching into an ocean. He's been doing this for 800 years. His awareness extends, she stopped, visibly searching for scale. I genuinely don't know how far. The room absorbed this. The Federation Charter, Picard said, bringing the conversation back to its axis, is clear on the rights of displaced peoples. The Jedi Order has arrived here through no choice of their own, from a universe that no longer contains them. Whatever concerns we have about their capabilities, our first obligation is humanitarian. With respect, Captain, Worf said, 10,000 warriors with abilities our sensors cannot quantify, led by a council that has already demonstrated the capacity to perceive classified ship systems, presents a security consideration that humanitarian instinct alone cannot resolve. Picard looked at Worf, noted, and I agree that we need answers. He paused, which is why I've requested a full council meeting tomorrow. Not a diplomatic briefing, a genuine dialogue. I want to know what they intend, not what they're willing to tell a first contact team, but what they actually plan. Guinan spoke for the first time. She had been listening with the particular quality of attention she brought to moments of genuine historical weight, the attention of someone who had seen civilizations rise and collide and sometimes, against all probability, learn from each other. You should know, she said, addressing the table without directing her words at anyone in particular, that whatever they tell you tomorrow, half of them don't agree with the other half. She paused. I spent an hour in their temple this afternoon. I could feel it. Not the way Troy feels things, but the way I feel history moving. They're not one thing, Captain. They're 10,000 people who just lost their world and haven't yet decided what to build in its place. Picard looked at her steadily. And what do you think they'll decide? Guinan picked up her tea. I think some of them will want to become something, and some of them will want to replace something. She took a sip. The question is which group speaks first. The observation lounge held that thought in silence while the Jedi Temple gleamed outside the viewport, ancient and magnificent, and full of people deciding, in the privacy of their own grief, who they were going to be in a universe that hadn't asked for them and might not be ready for the answer. The Romulan Senate did not panic. Panic was, by Romulan cultural consensus, a condition that happened to other species, humans, who wore their fear on their faces, Klingon who converted it noisily into aggression, Ferengi who converted it efficiently into profit margins. Romulans processed alarming information the way a master jeweler processed a rough stone, slowly, carefully, with complete attention to what could be made from it. Senator Vrax had been watching the Federation's subspace communications for 36 hours before the Tau Sheer report crossed his desk. He read it twice. Then he summoned his aide, requested a secured channel to the neutral zone listening post at Devorah Station, and spent 4 hours in private consultation with a woman whose name did not appear in any official Senate record. Subcommander Celine was 43 years old, spoke 11 languages including 2 that the Federation's universal translator still couldn't fully parse, and had spent the last decade running deep cover intelligence operations inside Federation territory with a success rate that the Tal Shir considered, in their most classified internal assessments, quietly miraculous. She was currently on Deck 7 of a Romulan warbird, cloaked at the edge of the neutral zone, drinking something warm and reading the same report Vrax had read. 10,000 force sensitives, she said, to no one in particular. In a structure the size of a small moon, arrived through a dimensional rift, currently parked 3 light years from Vulcan. She set down her drink, and the Federation's response is to send Picard, her aide, a young officer named Tarvin, who was learning to suppress his expressions with moderate success, said the Tal Shear's assessment is that this represents either the greatest strategic opportunity in the last century or an existential threat requiring immediate action, possibly both. The Tal Shear's assessments are always possibly both. Celine stood. What they're not saying, because they're constitutionally incapable of saying it, is that they're frightened. She moved to the viewport, where the neutral zone's invisible boundary divided normal space from the territory where things got complicated. Beings who can perceive thoughts, sense lies, move objects with their minds, and predict actions before they occur. In a universe where our primary intelligence advantages are cloaking, technology, and information control. She paused. A Romulan operative who can feel the emotional state of everyone in a room has been the Tal Shear's fantasy for 300 years. The Vulcans have telepathy, but they won't weaponize it. These Jedi are not Vulcans, Tarvin said. No, they are warriors who have lost their home. Warriors without a home need a purpose. And purposes can be, she chose the word with deliberate precision, shaped. The opportunity presented itself 48 hours later, in the form of a Jedi Knight named Sora Bulk. He was 41 years old by Jedi reckoning, a Weequay master who had come through the dimensional transit with his abilities intact and his faith considerably less so. He had lost 7 Padawans in the war that had driven them here. He had watched the Republic fall in real time, through battle meditation that let him feel every death on every front. Simultaneously, he had arrived in this new universe carrying 10,000 ghosts and a question the Jedi Code had never quite answered to his satisfaction. If the Force willed their survival, why had it allowed everything worth surviving for to be destroyed first? He was meditating in one of the temple's outer gardens, a terrace of pale stone that the Jedi's maintenance droids had pressurized and atmospherically regulated, open to a view of Federation space that was simultaneously beautiful and profoundly alien. When the Romulan made contact, she didn't decloak a ship. She didn't send a transmission. She materialized beside him using a transporter system so precisely calibrated that it defeated the Enterprise's proximity sensors entirely, sat down on the stone bench 3 meters away, and said nothing for 4 minutes. Sora Bulk opened his eyes. "You've been there for 6 minutes," he said. "You were deciding whether to speak." Celine showed no reaction to being perceived through active sensor suppression. She filed this away as professionally relevant and proceeded. "My government is interested in your situation." "Your government," he said, "has been running surveillance on this temple since we arrived. Your cloaked vessel is currently at bearing 227 Mark 44, approximately 80,000 kilometers off the temple's eastern face." He looked at her sideways. "You should know that. 3 other council members are aware of your ship's position. We've been discussing what to do about you." Celine recalibrated. This happened sometimes in the field, the moment when the asset you'd come to recruit turned out to be several steps ahead of where you'd place them on the board. Experienced operatives recognized this not as a setback, but as a renegotiation of terms. "Then perhaps we should skip the preliminary stage," she said, "and speak plainly. I would prefer that. My government believes the Federation will attempt to absorb your order, to regulate it, to file it within their bureaucratic structure alongside every other anomalous civilization they've encountered, and slowly, politely, completely neutralize everything that makes you dangerous." She paused. "We believe this would be a waste." Sora Bulk was quiet for a long moment. The Force moved around him in ways Celine couldn't perceive but could, in some atavistic human-adjacent way, almost feel a pressure change, a shift in the quality of the silence. "And your alternative?" he asked. "Resources. A base of operations outside Federation jurisdiction. The freedom to operate as the Jedi Order chooses. Without Starfleet oversight or prime directive. Restrictions." She let this settle before adding. "In exchange for periodic consultation. Information sharing. Nothing that compromises your principles." Nothing that compromises our principles, he repeated. And there was something in his voice that she couldn't read. Not agreement, not rejection, but a particular quality of consideration that she recognized, from long experience, as genuine. Tell me something. Your people, Romulans, do you have a word for what happens when someone receives exactly the offer they needed at exactly the moment their faith was weakest? We have several, she said carefully. In my experience, Sora Bulk said, standing, that moment is when the force is most worth listening to. He looked at her directly for the first time. I will bring your offer to the council. Not because I trust you, I can feel that you are measuring every word for strategic value, which suggests trust is not your primary currency, but because the council needs to know what options exist. He paused. And because you're right about one thing, the Federation will try to manage us. Whether that is worse than being managed by the Romulan Star Empire is a question worth asking. Celine stood as well. Will the council listen? Some of them. He began walking back toward the temple's inner corridors. The ones who've already started asking the same questions. I have. He stopped without turning. Your ship should move. The Enterprise is running a new sensor sweep in approximately 90 seconds. Even with your cloaking technology, the residual transporter signature will flag at close range. He walked inside. Celine had her transporter active before he'd taken 3 steps, returning to the Warbird with the precise, controlled urgency of a professional who had just realized that the asset she'd come to recruit was simultaneously more valuable and more dangerous than any briefing had suggested. She transmitted one word to Vrax on the secured channel before beginning her full report. Proceed. Aboard the Enterprise, Counselor. Troy stopped outside the observation lounge and put one hand against the bulkhead, steadying herself. Riker found her there 30 seconds later. Deanna? What's wrong? She looked at him with an expression that sat precisely between concern and fascination. Something just changed, she said. In the temple, something shifted, a decision, or the beginning of one. She shook her head slowly. They haven't been here 3 days, and already the lines are forming. The High Council meeting that Picard had requested took place not aboard the Enterprise, but within the Jedi Temple itself, a concession that Mace Windu had not demanded, but that Picard had offered, understanding instinctively that the location of a negotiation communicates as much as its content. You did not ask 10,000 displaced people to come to you. You went to them. The chamber they were given was called the Hall of Concord, a circular room with a domed ceiling that had been carved over centuries with the names of every significant diplomatic resolution the Jedi Order had brokered in their home galaxy. The names were in a script the Universal Translator rendered as visual static, which Data found fascinating and Worf found vaguely unsettling. The room smelled of the same ancient incense as the landing bay, deeper here, more concentrated, as though the stone itself had absorbed 1,000 years of contemplation and was slowly exhaling it. 12 Jedi Masters sat in a semicircle. Picard sat across from them with Troy, Data, and, at Windu's specific request, communicated through a brief and unreadable look at Worf during the previous day's preliminary discussions, the Klingon security chief himself. Yoda sat at the center of the semicircle, which told Picard everything about the Order's actual power, structure that their formal titles had left ambiguous. We will speak plainly, Windu opened, which Picard recognized as both a statement of intent and a mild rebuke of the diplomatic circumlocutions that first contact protocols typically demanded. The Force has brought us here. We accept this. What we have not yet accepted is what it means for us to be here, and what it means for you. I appreciate the directness, Picard said. I'll match it. The Federation's primary concern is stability. 10,000 individuals with abilities our science cannot fully quantify have arrived in the heart of Federation space. We want to understand your intentions, not because we fear you, but because we cannot responsibly protect either your people or ours without that understanding. Protect us, said a Jedi Master at the left end of the semicircle, a tall Saurian named Mundi, whose elongated skull gave his expressions an unusual geometry that Troy was finding difficult to read empathically. You speak of protection as though we are a problem to be contained. I speak of protection as a mutual obligation, Picard said evenly. The Federation has enemies. Some of them will see your arrival as either a threat or an opportunity. We would prefer to address that reality together rather than separately. Name them, said Master PLO Kuhn, whose voice came through a vocoder that translated the atmospheric requirements of his species into comprehensible standard. These enemies. Data answered with characteristic precision. The Romulan Star Empire maintains active intelligence operations throughout Federation space and has almost certainly already begun surveillance of your temple. The Borg Collective will detect your biological distinctiveness within weeks, possibly days, and will dispatch assets to investigate. The Cardassian Union is currently engaged in. We are aware of the Romulans, Windu said, with a flatness that made Troy's head turn sharply. Picard noticed. How aware? A pause that lasted exactly long. Enough to confirm that the pause was itself information. A Romulan operative made contact with a member of our order yesterday evening. Windu said. The Council was informed. The offer was brought before us this morning. The Enterprise officers absorbed this with varying degrees of visible reaction. Riker would have raised both eyebrows. Picard noted, while Worf was currently demonstrating the Klingon talent for expressing profound displeasure through absolute stillness. And the Council's response to this offer? Picard asked. Is why we are here, Yoda said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. His voice in this room had a different quality, not louder, but more present, as though the Hall of Concord amplified something in him that had nothing to do with acoustics. Divided we are, as your advisor suspected we would be. His eyes moved to Troy with an expression of calm acknowledgement that made the counselor sit slightly straighter. Feel it, could she? Smart, this one is. Troy said carefully. I sensed a fracture forming. I didn't want to presume. Presume, Yoda said, and it was not unkind. Useful honesty is, even when uncomfortable. Windu placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture that seemed simultaneously deliberate and ancient, the way certain formal gestures carry within them the weight of every time they've been performed before. There are those among us, he said, who believe the Force brought us here to continue our purpose, to be guardians of peace and justice in this galaxy, as we were in our own, to work alongside your Federation within your frameworks, contributing to a civilization that shares our values, if not our methods. And the others? Picard asked. The quality of silence that followed was different from ordinary diplomatic silence. It had texture. There are those, Windu continued, who believe the Federation's framework is itself the problem, that a civilization built on committee decisions, bureaucratic regulation, and a prime directive that prohibits intervention in the face of suffering is not a civilization worth working within, that the Force brought us here not to assist the Federation, but to, he stopped. To replace it, Picard said quietly. Windu met his gaze. Yes. The words sat in the room with the particular density of words that have been held back for some time before being released. Data spoke first because Data was constitutionally incapable of allowing a significant statement to go analytically unexamined. The Federation comprises 153 member worlds and protects the interests of approximately 985 billion beings across a territory spanning 8,000 light-years. Replacing it would require not merely political will, but a governing infrastructure capable of administering that territory, adjudicating disputes between species with radically different cultural frameworks, maintaining defensive capability against multiple hostile powers, and doing all of this while preserving the individual rights of nearly 1 trillion sentient beings. He paused. What would the Jedi Order propose as an alternative administrative structure? Mundi said, with perfect seriousness, the Force. Data processed this for 1.7 seconds. That is not an administrative structure. In our galaxy, Mundi replied. It was the closest thing to one that worked. Picard leaned forward. Masters, I want to be transparent with you about something. I have spent my career defending the Federation's ideals while acknowledging its failures. The Prime Directive has allowed suffering I found unconscionable. Our diplomatic processes have moved at speeds that cost lives. I am not here to tell you the Federation is perfect. He paused, making deliberate eye contact with Windu. then Yoda, then each master in turn. But I am here to tell you that the alternative to imperfect democracy is not enlightened theocracy. The alternative is power, and power, in my experience, does not remain enlightened for long. The room was very still. Yoda's eyes had not left Picard's face through this entire speech. Now the ancient master made a sound, low, considering the sound of 800 years of experience encountering something worth filing carefully. Seen much? You have, he said. Feel it, I can. The weight of it. He tilted his head. And yet, lead with hope, you still do. Not certainty, not authority. Hope. His ears rose slightly. Why? Picard considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because certainty, he said finally, is what tyrants have. Hope is what makes the rest of us keep trying. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Several of the masters exchanged looks that Troy, straining at the edges of her empathic range, characterized afterward in her report as recognition. Not agreement, not yet, but the specific feeling of encountering a mind that is worth disagreeing with. Carefully, outside the Hall of Concord's viewport, Federation space stretched in every direction, 8,000 light years of imperfect, struggling, genuinely trying civilization, completely unaware that 12 beings in a stone room were deciding, at that moment, whether it deserved to continue. The Borg had not been looking for the Jedi. This was, in the grand taxonomy of Borg behavior, essentially irrelevant. The collective did not look for things in the way that individual species looked for things with intention, with anticipation, with the particular cognitive narrowing that accompanied directed search. The Borg perceived, continuously, simultaneously, across thousands of vessels and billions of drones, distributed across the Delta and Beta quadrants like a vast, cold nervous system draped across the stars. They perceived and they cataloged, and occasionally something in the catalog triggered a response that individual species, anthropomorphizing the collective's behavior for their own psychological comfort, described as interest. The trigger, in this case, was midichlorians, a Borg scout vessel, a small, ruthlessly functional craft that Starfleet classified as a Type 3 probe, roughly the size of a runabout and approximately 1,000 times more dangerous, had been conducting a standard cataloging sweep of Federation border space when its biological sensors detected an unprecedented concentration of intracellular organisms exhibiting properties that did not correspond to any entry in the collective's accumulated knowledge of 10,000 species. The organisms appeared to interface directly with a measurable energy field of unknown classification. The field itself demonstrated properties that the collective's analytical subroutines flagged after 0.003 seconds of processing as potentially relevant to perfection. The scout vessel altered course. It dropped out of warp at 200,000 kilometers from the Jedi Temple at 0340 hours. Enterprise time, when the Gamma Shift crew was at minimum alertness and the Delta Watch officers were 17 minutes into a sensor recalibration that had temporarily reduced their long-range detection resolution by 12%. Whether the timing was deliberate or coincidental was a question that Lieutenant Commander Data would later spend considerable processing power on without reaching a satisfying conclusion. The first alert came not from the Enterprise's sensors, but from Master PLO Kuhn, who contacted the ship via comm badge and interface. The Jedi had adapted to with remarkable speed. Their force sensitivity apparently extending to intuitive comprehension of unfamiliar technology at 0341 hours. Something approaches, he said, without preamble. Something that is not alive. Something that is many things pretending to be one thing. A pause. It is wrong in a way I find difficult to articulate. Not evil, precisely. Absent. As though whatever was alive in it was removed and replaced with function. Lieutenant Hawk, commanding the Gamma Shift Bridge, had the presence of mind to go to yellow alert before fully processing what a Jedi Master's force perception meant as a sensor reading. It was the right call. The Borg scout vessel decloaked. They didn't typically cloak, but this variant had been modified for reconnaissance in a way that Starfleet's tactical database hadn't yet catalogued at 150,000 kilometers and began an immediate active scan of the temple. By the time Picard reached the bridge, Data was already at his station and Worf was standing over the tactical console with the focused intensity of a man who had encountered the Borg before and retained, beneath layers of Klingon discipline, a respect for them that he would never describe as fear, but that functioned identically. One scout vessel, Data reported. Shields at standard. No weapons lock established. Their scan is focused entirely on the temple, specifically on the biological readings emanating from it. They have not scanned us. They already know everything about us, Picard said, with the flat economy of a man stating a fact he found personally objectionable. He'd been assimilated once. He knew precisely how comprehensive Borg knowledge of Starfleet was. He took his chair. Hail them. The view screen showed the scout vessel, angular, dark, radiating the Borg's characteristic indifference to aesthetics against the backdrop of the temples. Pale stone. The contrast was almost philosophical. The Borg did not respond to the hail. They continued scanning. Inside the temple, the response was immediate and entirely unlike anything Starfleet's protocols had anticipated. Yoda had not slept. This was not unusual at his age and discipline level. Sleep was optional in ways that humanoid biology typically didn't permit, the Force providing a form of restoration that conventional rest approximated, but never matched. He had been in the temple's central meditation chamber when the scout vessel arrived, and he had felt it before any sensor or any comm badge registered it. Felt it the way one felt a cold draft through a wall, a wrongness in the texture of the living force that surrounded him. He assembled the available council members in 4 minutes. Mace Windu arrived still adjusting his robe. Mundi arrived already calm, which was either admirable or slightly inhuman, depending on one's perspective. Borg, Windu said, reading from a data PADD that Hawk had transmitted during the alert. Cybernetic collective. Consciousness. Assimilation-driven. They wish to add our biological and technological distinctiveness to their own. Read the file before the file was sent. I had, Yoda said. He was standing at the chamber's central viewport, looking at the scout vessel with an expression that was not alarm, but something older and more considered than alarm, the expression of someone calculating distance not in kilometers, but in consequences. Feel them, can you? He addressed this to the room generally. Try. The masters reached out through the Force simultaneously. What they encountered made 3 of them step back involuntarily. It was not the darkness of a Sith, not the hot, consuming corruption that the Force-sensitive recognized as the shadow side of their own nature. It was something different, something that the Force had no existing vocabulary for, because it had never encountered it before. The Borg drones were alive, biologically, technically, unambiguously alive, and yet their connection to the Force was not merely suppressed but replaced, where a living being carried a signature in the Force, the way a candle carried flame. Each Borg drone carried something that looked, from the Force's perspective, like the outline of a flame from which the fire had been methodically extracted and replaced with cold light. 10,000 drones on that scout vessel. 10,000 absences shaped like presences. Master Depa Balaba, who had spent 3 days discussing the Force's nature with Data and had therefore been thinking more carefully than most about the relationship between consciousness and energy, said quietly, "They've been assimilated out of the Force." "Not out of it," Yoda corrected. "Cut off from it. Still there underneath. Feel it. I can buried. Waiting." His ears flattened. "Sad it is. Very sad." Windu's jaw set. "Sad or not, they're scanning us with clear intent. And if their database on the Federation is as complete as Picard suggests, they know exactly what we are." He was right. The collective knew. In the 4.2 minutes since the scout vessel had begun scanning, the aggregated processing power of the entire Borg collective had been running analyses on the Jedi Temple's biological readings. The conclusions were unprecedented in the collective's accumulated history, not because the Jedi were the most powerful beings they had encountered, but because the Force field, mediating their biology, represented something the collective had never successfully assimilated, an energy phenomenon that appeared to originate in and respond to consciousness itself. The collective's directive was clear. Assimilate. adapt, achieve perfection. The transmission came through on all frequencies simultaneously. The voice was the specific auditory horror of the Borg, layered, harmonic, devoid of the emotional colorations that made voices human or Klingon or Vulcan, carrying within it the weight of 10,000 species who had heard it last. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile. Picard's hands tightened on his armrests by precisely the amount necessary to confirm that he was controlling his reaction rather than suppressing it. Red alert, he said. Shields up. Worf, lock phasers on the scout vessel. Do not fire unless fired upon. He opened a channel to the temple. Master Windu, the Borg have made their intentions clear. I recommend we discuss a coordinated response. Windu's voice came back immediately. Agreed. Though I should tell you, the Council has already voted. Voted on what? On whether to let you handle this. A pause with a specific quality to it, not hesitation, but the beat of someone choosing their phrasing with care. The vote was not unanimous. Before Picard could respond, the temple's outer facing, the pale, ancient stone of the structure's eastern wall, began to glow. Not with weapons fire, not with shields, with something that the Enterprise's sensors registered as a massive force field mobilization, 10,000 Jedi drawing simultaneously on the energy that permeated this universe's untouched, ancient reservoir of the Force, channeling it outward in a coordinated exercise of collective will that made. Counselor Troy grabbed the arms of her chair and exhaled sharply, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the sheer scale of focused intention radiating from the temple. The Borg scout vessel stopped scanning. In the 1.3 seconds of processing that followed, the collective encountered something it had not encountered in 10,000 assimilated species, a phenomenon it could detect, measure, and completely fail to classify. The force field surrounding the temple was not technological. It was not biological in any framework the collective possessed. It responded to attention in ways that defied the collective's predictive models. It was, by every metric the Borg could apply, simultaneously present and impossible. The scout vessel's weapons systems came online. They're going to fire, Worf said, with the particular clarity of a man stating a fact he finds professionally galvanizing. I know, Picard said. He opened the channel to the temple again. Master Windu, whatever the Council voted, now would be the time. The response was not Windu's voice. It was Yoda's, and it carried, even through the comm system's compression algorithms, something that made the bridge crew sit slightly straighter without knowing why. Ready? We are, the Ancient Master said. Been ready we have. For a very long time. The Borg scout vessel fired. The energy discharge was a standard cutting beam, the collective's preferred opening instrument, calibrated to breach Federation shield harmonics with the methodical efficiency of a surgeon's first incision. It was, by Borg standards, almost polite. An introduction rather than an attack. A statement of intent dressed in the language of inevitability. It never reached the temple. What stopped it was not a shield in any sense that Starfleet engineering recognized. There were no emitters, no deflector arrays, no energy grid to modulate or adapt. What stopped it was 12 Jedi Masters standing in a circle in the Hall of Concord with their eyes closed and their hands slightly raised, channeling through the Force a collective. Actival so focused and precise that the cutting beam, a coherent stream of energy that had previously breached the shields of Galaxy-class starships, slowed, bent, and dissipated into harmless radiation, approximately 40 meters from the temple's outer wall. On the Enterprise's bridge, LaForge watched his console display this event in real time and said, very quietly, that is not possible. Clearly, Data replied, it is. The Borg processed the deflection in 0.8 seconds and made the tactical adjustment that the collective always made. When a weapon proved ineffective, they escalated. The scout vessel began charging its primary assimilation beam, a technology reserved for planetary-scale targets, capable of simultaneously transmitting nanoprobe payloads to thousands of biological organisms across a wide area. If it reached the temple, the first wave of Jedi would begin cybernetic conversion within minutes. Picard was already moving. Worf, full phaser spread, target their primary weapon array. Fire. The Enterprise's phaser banks discharged in a concentrated volley that struck the scout vessel's weapon assembly with precisely calibrated force. The assimilation beam collapsed mid-charge. The scout vessel rocked, not severely, not enough to neutralize it, but enough to interrupt the sequence and by seconds that felt. In the particular economy of crisis, like considerably more. They're adapting shield frequencies, Worf reported. Our phasers will be ineffective within 2 more volleys. Photon torpedoes, full spread. Captain, it was Troy, her voice carrying the specific urgency she reserved for moments when her empathic senses delivered information that tactical displays couldn't. Something is happening in the temple. Something large. The force signature is, she stopped, pressing her fingers briefly to her temple. Building. All of them. Every Jedi in the temple is contributing to something. I can feel the intention behind it, and it is, she paused, it is not a weapon. She was right and wrong in the way that empathic perception sometimes captured essence while missing specificity. What the Jedi were building was not a weapon in the sense that phasers or torpedoes were weapons. It was something the Order called, in their own philosophical framework, a convergence, a technique so rarely employed that most living Jedi masters had never participated in one, documented only in the temple's deepest archives as a theoretical maximum of collective force application. It required every willing, force-sensitive in proximity to surrender individual focus entirely, subsuming personal consciousness into a unified current of force energy directed by a single guiding mind. The guiding mind, by unanimous and instantaneous council consensus, was Yoda. 800 years of discipline, 800 years of listening to the force in its quietest registers and its loudest, 800 years of understanding. That power was not the point, that the point was always, only clarity. What Yoda felt in the moment that 10,000 streams of force energy converged through him was not the rush of power that dark side practitioners described when they spoke of the force as a tool of domination. It was something closer to the feeling of a river finding its course, the sensation of enormous energy moving not because it was pushed, but because it had found the path of least resistance toward something true. He reached through the force into the Borg scout vessel, not to destroy it, not to damage it further, to find what was underneath. The Borg drones aboard the vessel were 47 in number. Each one had once been something else, a Tarian engineer, a human colonist, a Balian trader, species and histories and individual moments of consciousness that the collective had absorbed and filed and forgotten. The Force could not undo assimilation. It could not remove nanoprobes or restore severed neural pathways or return to 47 beings the lives that had been taken from them. What it could do, what Yoda did, with a precision that cost him more than he showed, was find the buried thread of individual consciousness in each drone and pull it gently to the surface, not free them, not restore them, simply remind them, for a moment, that they had once been someone. The effect on the collective was unprecedented. The Borg's greatest strength was also, as Picard had learned at considerable personal cost, its most fundamental vulnerability. The hive mind was only as coherent as the consensus of its components. When 47 drones simultaneously experienced a microsurge of individual consciousness, a flash of memory, identity, self, the local node of the collective that coordinated the scout vessel's tactical operations experienced something it had no framework to process. Doubt, not the rational recalculation of tactical probabilities that the collective performed constantly, not the adaptive response to new weapons data, something older and more destabilizing than either. The 47 drones paused in their functions for 2.3 seconds, an eternity in Borg operational terms, as each one processed the inexplicable sensation of remembering, briefly, who they had been. The scout vessel's weapons went offline. Worf stared at his console. Their weapon systems have deactivated. Shields are fluctuating. They are not. He stopped, rechecking. They are not adapting. They appear to be. Another pause, during which a Klingon warrior who had faced the Borg in 3 separate Engagements searched for the right word. Confused. Confused, Riker repeated. From the seat he'd taken beside Picard at the start of the alert. He let the word sit for a moment. The Borg are confused. Confirmed, Data said. I am reading unusual variants in the collective's tactical subroutines. The pattern is consistent with processing interruption rather than damage. They are attempting to re-establish consensus. Estimated time to full tactical restoration, for minutes, 20 seconds. Picard opened the channel to the temple immediately. Master Yoda, what did you do? The old master's voice came back sounding. For the first time since his arrival, tired. Not depleted. The distinction was important. And Troy caught it, but carrying the specific weight of someone who had spent something they could not easily replace. Reminded them, Yoda said simply, what they were before. Will it hold? No. Return, the collective will. Adapt, they will, as they always do. But understand something, Captain. Felt us, they have now. Felt the Force. And classify it, they cannot. A pause. Afraid, the Borg do not become. But uncertain. Another pause, longer. Uncertain, they have become. And uncertain, they will report. Picard processed this. You've just ensured the full collective's attention. Yes. That was your intention. A sound that, filtered through the comm system's compression, resolved into something adjacent to wry acknowledgement. Better, it is, to be seen clearly by a great threat than to be surprised by one. Know where we are, the Borg do now. Know what we are, they do not. This, Yoda's voice carried something that Troy would later describe as the Force equivalent of a chess player advancing a piece, is the more useful position. The scout vessel, its tactical systems, still cycling through the restoration of collective consensus, began to withdraw, slowly. Not in retreat, the Borg did not retreat in any psychological sense, but in the specific tactical behavior of an entity that had encountered an unknown variable and required time to fully process its implications before proceeding. It jumped to warp at the edge of sensor range, heading Delta Quadrant. The bridge held a moment of silence that contained, in roughly equal measure, relief and dread. They'll be back, Riker said. With a cube, Worf said, in the tone of a man who considers this a professional certainty. Possibly several, Data agreed. Picard stood slowly. The way a man stands when the immediate crisis has passed and the larger crisis, it was merely the opening act of becomes fully visible. He turned to face the viewport, the temple gleaming in Federation space. Ancient and impossible and absolutely, irrevocably present. Inside the Hall of Concord, the Council was reconvening. The Convergence had done something that the tactical victory over the scout vessel hadn't. It had demonstrated, to every Jedi in the temple, what 10,000 of them could accomplish together, what they could accomplish against threats that Federation technology alone could not stop. Troy felt the shift from across 200,000 kilometers of space, and the feeling that accompanied it was not triumph. It was the specific emotional texture she had learned, over years of counseling, to recognize as the moment when a group of people stopped asking what are we going to do and started asking what are we going to become. She said nothing to Picard immediately. Some things needed to be said carefully, and carefully required preparation. But she made a note in her personal log that evening, in language more direct than her official reports typically permitted. The Borg encounter did not frighten the Jedi. It reminded them of their purpose. I am not certain, tonight, whether that is reassuring or the most alarming thing that has happened since they arrived, 3 light years away. In the Romulan warbird still cloaked at the neutral zone's edge, Subcommander Celine watched the scout vessel's retreat on her sensor display and transmitted a second message to Senator Vrax. It contained 3 words. Accelerate the timeline. The Federation Council convened an emergency session 40 hours after the Borg scout vessel's withdrawal, and Picard attended via holographic projection from the Enterprise's observation lounge, a technology that allowed him to be present on Earth without being present on Earth, which he found, given the current political temperature in the council chamber, a not entirely unwelcome arrangement. The chamber was full. This was itself significant. Emergency sessions typically drew the council members most directly affected by a crisis and the representatives most interested in being seen responding to one. This session had drawn everyone. 153 member worlds, each represented by a delegate whose expression fell somewhere on a spectrum between barely contained alarm and the studied neutrality of politicians who had learned to perform calm as a professional skill. President Jareshinyo spoke first, because the office required it, and because someone had to say the thing that everyone in the room was thinking, in terms carefully calibrated to sound like governance rather than panic. The situation is without precedent, he said, which was both accurate and, Picard thought, approximately the least useful thing that could be said. 10,000 beings of extraordinary capability have arrived in Federation space through means we cannot replicate or fully understand. They have demonstrated the capacity to neutralize Borg weaponry using a method that defies our scientific framework. They have been contacted by Romulan intelligence, and we have, as yet, no formal agreement, no treaty, no established legal framework for their presence. Admiral Nechayev, attending in person from Starfleet Command, was more direct. She had spent 30 years being more direct than the situation strictly required and considered this a professional virtue. What we have, she said, is 10,000 extremely powerful individuals in the middle of Federation space with no legal status, no treaty obligations, no Starfleet oversight, and the demonstrated ability to affect Borg drones at the level of individual consciousness. That is not a diplomatic situation. That is a security situation that happens to be wearing diplomatic clothing. With respect, Admiral, Picard said, from his holographic position at the chamber's secondary podium. Treating it as a security situation will make it one. It already is one, Captain. It is a situation with security implications. The distinction matters. He paused, organizing his thoughts with the deliberate precision of a man who had spent the last 40 hours doing very little else. The Jedi Order is not a threat seeking opportunity. They are a civilization seeking purpose in circumstances they did not choose. The Romulan contact was brought to us voluntarily. Windu disclosed it unprompted, which is not the behavior of an organization planning hostile action. The Borg encounter demonstrated capability, yes, but also restraint. They had the means to destroy that scout vessel. They chose not to. They chose to reveal those means, Nechayev said, which the Borg will now adapt against. The Borg would have found them regardless. The question was never whether the collective would detect the temple. The question is whether, when the Borg return, we face them alongside 10,000 Force sensitives or across from them. The chamber absorbed this in the way that large groups of politicians absorb arguments that are correct but inconvenient, with visible discomfort and a collective instinct to reframe rather than accept. It was the Vulcan delegate, Ambassador Soval, who provided the reframe that stuck. The captain's point has strategic merit, he said, with the specific Vulcan intonation that indicated he was acknowledging an argument's logic without endorsing its emotional weight. However, the Council's concern is not merely tactical. The Jedi Order's internal division, which Starfleet's reports confirm, presents a scenario in which Federation alliance with the Order draws us into a factional conflict we did not choose and cannot fully control. The question is not whether to engage the Jedi. The question is which Jedi we are engaging with, and whether that engagement commits us to outcomes we have not consented to. It was, Picard reflected, an excellent point delivered in the tone of a mild weather observation. The session produced no resolution, which was its own kind of resolution, a political acknowledgement that the situation exceeded current frameworks and required time that the situation was not necessarily going to provide. Meanwhile, Section 31 had already stopped waiting. The organization that officially did not exist had been tracking the Jedi Temple since Hour 1, through surveillance assets embedded in Starfleet's own sensor network that the official chain of command was not aware of and would have found deeply objectionable if it had been. Section 31's operational philosophy was simple, durable, and entirely incompatible with the Federation's stated values. The Federation's survival justified measures the Federation's principles prohibited. This philosophy had survived 2 centuries of application because its adherents were careful, because its successes were classified, and because the people most likely to object to it were, by definition, not cleared to know it existed. The operative who entered the Jedi Temple at 0200 hours on the 42nd day of the Order's presence in Federation space was named Dorian Cole. He was 38, a former Starfleet intelligence officer of exceptional competence, and he had been given an objective that his Section 31 handler had described, with characteristic understatement, as sensitive. He was there to recruit a Jedi, not for information, not for consultation, for operational deployment. A force-sensitive operative who could perceive deception, move without detection, influence minds under interrogation, and operate in environments where conventional intelligence methods failed. The handler's briefing had been clinical and precise about the potential applications, and entirely silent about the ethical implications, which was itself a form of answer about the organization's priorities. Cole had done his research. He'd identified his target carefully, not the fractured masters wrestling with questions of purpose and replacement, but a younger operative, a Jedi Knight named Ayla Secura, a Twi'lek woman in her early 30s whose combat record in her home galaxy was exceptional and whose force sensitivity scores, as Data had calculated them from the biological scans, were among the highest in the temple. More importantly, and this was the detail that Section 31 considered decisive, she had been arguing in council sessions that Troy's empathic reports had partially reconstructed for a pragmatic engagement with Federation institutions rather than either replacement or withdrawal. She would, the handler had assessed, be open to useful work. She was not. Cole found her in the temple's training halls, a vast vaulted space where Jedi Knights and Padawans maintained their physical and force discipline through exercises that, to an outside observer, looked simultaneously like gymnastics, meditation, and something that belonged in a Klingon martial arts demonstration. She was running a lightsaber training sequence alone, the blue blade casting moving light across ancient stone, her movements carrying the quality of something practiced so many thousands of times that it had become pure expression rather than technique. She stopped when he entered, not because she heard him, he was professionally silent, but because she felt him. She turned, deactivated the blade, and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has perceived the shape of a conversation before it begins. "You're not Starfleet," she said. "I represent Federation interests," Cole said, which was technically accurate. "You represent a part of the Federation that the rest of it doesn't know about." She tilted her head slightly. "I can feel the difference. The people on the Enterprise feel open, conflicted sometimes, but open. You feel like a room with the windows painted shut." Cole processed this metaphor and proceeded. He delivered the pitch with professional precision, the opportunity, the resources, the operational independence, the chance to do meaningful work in service of genuine stability. He was good at this. He had recruited 17 assets in 11 years and lost none of them to exposure. Ayla listened to the entire pitch without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds, long enough that he began constructing his secondary approach. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to understand that I'm telling you because it's true and because you deserve to hear something true from someone today." She met his eyes directly. The dark side doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with red lightsabers and anger and obvious corruption. Sometimes it comes with reasonable arguments and genuine belief in a good cause and the absolute conviction that the ends are important enough to justify the methods. She paused. "I've seen what that looks like at scale. I watched it happen to our republic." Another pause. "I won't be part of it happening to yours." Cole said nothing for a moment. In 11 years of intelligence work, he had been refused before. He had not previously been refused by someone who made him feel, in the specific way that Ayla Secura made him feel, that the refusal was an act of generosity rather than opposition. "How did you know I'd come?" he asked, because he genuinely wanted to know. "I didn't," she said. "But Master Yoda suggested I spend time in the training hall tonight." He didn't say why. A small, complicated smile. He rarely does. Cole left the temple the way he'd entered, quietly, professionally, without incident. In his operational report, filed through channels that Starfleet Command would never see, he wrote, "Asset declined recruitment. Recommend reassessment of approach. Note for operational record. The target identified the organization's nature through methods that our current threat models do not account for. This represents a significant intelligence vulnerability. What he did not write, because Section 31 reports had no category for it, was the thing he was still thinking about on the shuttle back to his insertion point, the feeling of being genuinely, completely, and not unkindly seen by someone who had no motive to be kind about it. Troy filed her own report that same morning. Based on empathic readings she'd been tracking for 6 hours, she addressed it directly to Picard and marked it urgent. The fracture in the council is widening. Mundi's faction met for 4 hours last night without informing Windu. Whatever they're planning, they've moved from discussion to logistics. We may have less time than we thought. Mundi moved at dawn. Not metaphorically. The Syrian master had spent 43 days in a universe governed by science and committee and the slow, grinding machinery of democratic process, and he had arrived through a route that was entirely logical from within his own philosophical framework, at a conclusion that Mace Windu had feared and Yoda had foreseen, and neither had been able to prevent. That waiting was itself a choice, and that the choice to wait was costing the galaxy something it could not afford to lose. His argument, presented to the 17 masters who had aligned with his faction over 6 weeks of quiet, careful conversation, was not the argument of a tyrant. It was the argument of someone who had watched a civilization fail and believed he understood why. The Republic had fallen, not because it lacked power, but because it lacked clarity, because its democratic institutions had been patient while corruption was not, deliberate while manipulation moved at the speed of whispered words in Senate corridors. The Jedi had been the Republic's guardians, and they had failed, not through weakness but through restraint, through the endless, principled, fatal deference to a system that was being hollowed out from within. While they watched and debated and trusted the process, the Federation, Mundi believed, was making the same mistakes. Section 31 existed, a shadow organization operating beneath a democracy's skin, doing precisely what democracy prohibited, sustained by the same logic that had once sustained the Sith, that the ends justified the means if the ends were important enough. The Romulan Star Empire was actively recruiting within the temple. The Borg would return, and the Federation Council's response to all of this was another session, another debate, another careful resolution that resolved nothing. The Force had not brought them here to watch another civilization fail in slow motion. His faction moved in 3 simultaneous actions, coordinated through the Force with a precision that no comm system could have matched and no counterintelligence operation could have anticipated, because the coordination happened entirely in the shared medium of 10,000 living minds woven together by an energy field that Federation sensors still could not fully map. The first action was a display of presence. 60 Jedi Knights deployed through the Jedi Temple's external platforms in full visibility, not aggressively, not with weapons drawn, but standing in the specific way that Jedi stood when they wanted to be understood as a force, rather than a collection of individuals. The Enterprise's sensors tracked all 60 simultaneously, and Worf went to red alert before Picard had fully processed what he was seeing. The second action was a transmission. Mundi broadcast on all Federation subspace frequencies simultaneously, a technical feat that should have been impossible from within the temple without Starfleet communication infrastructure, accomplished instead through a force-assisted amplification of the temple's own subspace resonance. That data would spend 3 weeks attempting to fully document. The message was 11 minutes long, carefully composed, and addressed not to Starfleet Command or the Federation Council, but to every sentient being within range of a Federation subspace receiver. Picard listened to it in his ready room with Troy and Riker standing, because sitting felt wrong for what he was hearing. Mundi's voice was calm throughout. That was the most unsettling part, not the content, which was alarming enough, but the absolute, genuine serenity of a man who believed completely in what he was saying. He spoke about the Force, about what it meant for a galaxy to have spent 10,000 years with this energy field present and untended, a resource of incomprehensible depth available, to every living being, ignored because no one had known to listen for it. He spoke about the Federation's failures, not with contempt, but with the specific sorrow of someone cataloging the mistakes of people they respected. Section 31. The Prime Directive's cost in lives not saved. The Cardassian occupation of Bajorans, which had continued for decades under Federation. Awareness and diplomatic protest that changed. Nothing while millions suffered. He spoke about what the Jedi Order could offer, not domination, not theocracy, not the replacement of democracy with mysticism, but guidance, clarity. The Force as a tool of governance, not in the sense of control, but in the sense of truth, a council of individuals who could perceive deception, sense suffering at distance, feel the moral weight of decisions in ways that no committee vote could replicate. He was proposing, in language that was careful and sincere and genuinely persuasive, that the Jedi High Council become a second chamber of Federation governance, a body without legislative power but with veto, authority over decisions that the Force identified as fundamentally contrary to the welfare of living beings. He called it, with a simplicity that was either profound or terrifying depending on where you stood, the Living Senate. The third action was the one that made all diplomatic options immediately secondary. Sora Bulk, whose conversation with the Romulan operative Selene 6 weeks earlier had been reported to the Council and had resulted in a formal censure that had done nothing to change his fundamental orientation, had spent those 6 weeks making a different kind of preparation. He had identified, through his own Force sensitivity and careful observation, the location of every critical Federation infrastructure node within sensor range of the temple, power relay stations, subspace communication hubs, the primary EPS conduit that fed the Starfleet Tactical Operations Center on Vulcan. He had not sabotaged any of them. He didn't need to. He simply, at the moment Mundi's transmission began, reached out through the Force and made it absolutely clear that he could. Every identified node flickered, once, simultaneously, for exactly 1.3 seconds. The message was unmistakable. We know where the lights are. We could turn them off. We are choosing not to. It was, Picard reflected in the 3 seconds between the flicker and his red alert order, the most sophisticated act of coercive diplomacy he had ever witnessed. Sophisticated because it demonstrated capability without causing harm. Sophisticated because it gave the Federation a choice rather than a fait accompli. And sophisticated, most disturbingly, because it was, within its own moral framework, genuinely restrained. The Enterprise was at red alert. All weapons locked on the Temple's external platforms. When Mace Windu's voice came through on a direct channel to Picard's comm badge, not the ship's comm system, the badge itself, reached through a Force-assisted subspace connection that bypassed every encryption protocol the Enterprise possessed. Captain Windu's voice carried something Picard had not heard in it before, not defeat, and not quite desperation, but the specific strain of a man holding something very heavy while someone else decides whether to help. I need you to stand down your weapons. Master Windu, your people just demonstrated the ability to affect Federation infrastructure across multiple star systems. Mundi's people, not mine. A pause that had weight in it. Not Yoda's. Is that a distinction the Federation Council will recognize right now? It is the only distinction that matters. Another pause. I am asking you to trust me, Captain. I am aware of how much that costs you in this moment. I am asking anyway. Picard looked at Riker. Riker's expression said, "This is the decision that doesn't come with a good option, and you're the one who has to make it. Stand down weapons," Picard said. Maintain red alert. In the Temple's deepest meditation chamber, Yoda was already moving. He had not participated in Mundi's action. He had not spoken against it in the final hours before it launched, which some of the factions members had interpreted as tacit acceptance, and which was, in fact, something considerably more complex, the deliberate choice of a master who understood that preventing the action by force would fracture the order beyond repair, and that the only path through this moment was not prevention but response. He moved through the Temple's corridors with the unhurried speed of someone for whom urgency and stillness were not opposites, and he arrived at the external platform where Mundi stood at the center of his 60 knights. looking out at Federation space with the expression of a man who has crossed a threshold and is only now fully registering that thresholds, once crossed, do not uncross. Yoda stood beside him for a long moment without speaking. Know what you will say, Mundi said. Said it to myself, many times, in the weeks before tonight. And still this. And still this. The Surian master's voice was quiet, genuine, carrying no defensiveness, only the particular tiredness of a conviction fully spent. I watched the Republic fall, Master. I watched us deliberate while it burned. I cannot. His voice remained steady, but the steadiness was effortful. I cannot watch it happen again. Neither can I, Yoda said. And then, after a pause, different, our responses are. Both from grief. Both from love. He looked up at the stars, Federation stars. Alien and beautiful and full of a force that had been waiting 10,000 years for someone to listen to it. Wrong, you are not about the Federation's failures. Wrong, you are not. About Section 31. About Bajorans. About the cost of restraint. He paused. Wrong, you are, about what we are for. Mundi said nothing. Guardians, we are, Yoda continued. Not governors. Guard from within, we can. Replace from above. He shook his head. Seen that story, I have. Ends only one way. The 60 knights on the platform were listening. All of them, in the particular way that Force sensitives listen when a master of Yoda's depth speaks, not passively, not merely with their ears, but with the full current of their sensitivity, feeling the truth of words in the Force before their meaning resolves in language. Mundi closed his eyes. The Force moved around him, not the focused, directed current of his earlier action, but something more turbulent, the emotional, whether of a mind reconsidering, something it had committed to completely. He opened his eyes. What do you propose? He asked. Propose, Yoda said, that we let Picard answer Mundi's transmission, and that we listen, he tilted his head, very carefully, to what a man who still believes in imperfect things chooses to say. On the Enterprise, Picard was standing at the view screen in his ready room, looking at Mundi's transmission data, and composing in his mind a response that would need to be the most precise thing he had ever said, because the audience was not the Federation Council, not Starfleet Command, not the Diplomatic Corps. The audience was 10,000 beings who had lost everything, who possessed capabilities that dwarfed conventional power, and who were, at this moment, making a decision about whether the galaxy's existing civilization was worth believing in. He thought about what Yoda had asked him in the Hall of Concord. Why hope? He thought about his answer. He opened the channel. Picard did not prepare notes. He had considered it, had sat at his desk for 20 minutes with a blank PADD and a cup of Earl Grey gone cold, and had ultimately decided that notes were the wrong instrument for this particular moment. Notes implied a message crafted for an audience. What this required was something closer to testimony, the unmediated account of what a person actually believed, offered without the protective architecture of prepared language to a group of people who could feel the difference between conviction and performance at a distance of several light years. He stood at the Enterprise's main view screen and opened the channel on all Federation subspace frequencies, matching Mundi's broadcast reach exactly, using Starfleet's own infrastructure rather than Force-amplified subspace resonance, which felt like the right symbolic distinction to make, and he spoke for 9 minutes and 40 seconds. He began with acknowledgement. Not apology. Apology would have been both premature and dishonest, but the specific act of recognition that Picard considered the foundation of any genuine dialogue, the acknowledgement that the other person had said something true. Mundi was right about Section 31. He was right about Bajorans. He was right about the Prime Directive's cost, about the gap between the Federation's stated values and its practiced ones, about the danger of institutions that had learned to protect themselves more efficiently than they protected the principles they were built to serve. Picard said all of this plainly, on every subspace frequency within range, in full knowledge that the Federation Council was listening, and that Admiral Nechayev was almost certainly developing a headache that would last several days. Then he said the thing that mattered. The Jedi Order lost their republic, he said, because its institutions were corrupted slowly from within, by people who believed the cause was important enough to justify the corruption. I want to ask the Jedi, and I want to ask every being receiving this transmission, too. Consider what that process looked like from the outside, from the perspective of someone watching it happen. It looked like good people making reasonable arguments. It looked like genuine concern for genuine problems. It looked like intelligence agencies operating beyond oversight because the threats were real. It looked, at every step, like the people involved believed completely that they were doing what was necessary. He paused. The difference between that and what Master Mundi is proposing tonight is not a difference in intention. It is not a difference in capability or in the authenticity of Jedi wisdom. The difference is structural. Power that answers to no authority except its own judgment, however good that judgment is, however refined by years of discipline, and force sensitivity and genuine moral seriousness, is not a safeguard against the thing that destroyed the Republic. It is the thing that destroyed the Republic, called by a different name. The transmission was received in the Hall of Concord in complete silence. Mundi stood at the platform's edge and listened. Through a comm system that PLO Kuhn had patched directly from the Enterprise's broadcast, and he listened with the force as well as his ears, feeling the shape of the words beneath the words, the emotional architecture of a man who had staked his credibility entirely on honesty and was not performing it. Picard continued. He spoke about what the Federation could offer the Jedi, not management, as Windu had correctly rejected, but partnership, legal status, the protection of Federation membership extended to the Temple and its inhabitants, as a sovereign entity, the establishment of a formal, consultative role for the Jedi High Council and Federation diplomatic and ethical deliberations, advisory, not authoritative, with influence earned through wisdom rather than enforced through capability. A research partnership between Starfleet, science, and the Jedi Temple to study the Force, conducted collaboratively, with full transparency on both sides. He spoke about what the Jedi could offer the Federation in return, and here his voice shifted slightly, carrying something warmer than the careful precision of his opening. Not the operational capabilities that Section 31 had coveted and Ayla Secura had correctly refused. Something different. The Jedi's presence in this universe meant that the Force, wild and ancient and untended for 10,000 years, now had gardeners, that every living being in the Federation existed within a field of energy that responded to consciousness, to intention, to the collective moral weight of civilizational choices. The Jedi could not govern that field, but they could listen to it. And in listening, they could offer something that no censor, array, or diplomatic, protocol, or democratic process could provide on its own, a form of awareness that felt the cost of decisions. In the living tissue of the universe itself, I am not asking the Jedi to trust the Federation's institutions, Picard said. Near the end, I am asking the Jedi to help us build better ones. Not from above, alongside. Because the alternative, Master Mundi, is not a Federation improved by Jedi wisdom. The alternative is a Federation replaced by Jedi certainty. And certainty, he paused. And in the pause, every listener felt the weight of everything he had seen in 30 years of command. Certainty has never saved anyone who didn't first earn the right to it through doubt. He closed the channel. The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurs when a large number of people are processing something simultaneously, and none of them have yet decided what to say. Mundi stood on the platform for a long time. The 60 knights around him were still there, Force signatures carrying the turbulent mixture of genuine moral reckoning that Troy, monitoring from the Enterprise, described afterward as the feeling of a tide reversing, slow, powerful, and not quite complete. Then Mundi stepped back from the platform's edge. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a declaration or a formal concession, or a moment with the clean, narrative shape of a resolution. It was simply a man stepping back from a threshold he had decided not to cross, quietly, without theater, with the specific dignity of someone whose change of mind had cost them something real and who was not pretending otherwise. Yoda, standing 3 meters behind him, said nothing. His ears rose slightly. The response from the galaxy came in layers over the following hours. The Federation Council's official statement was careful and diplomatic and said very little, which in political terms meant the crisis had been survived without requiring anyone to make binding decisions they weren't ready to make. Admiral Nechayev transmitted a private message to Picard that contained 4 words. "We will discuss this," in a tone that suggested the discussion would be thorough and not entirely comfortable. The Klingon High Council, whose ambassador had been monitoring subspace traffic with the focused interest of an empire that respected strength and had been paying very close attention to the Jedi since the Borg encounter, transmitted a formal inquiry to the temple requesting an audience with Master Windu. The message used the word "worthy" 3 times, which the cultural attaché confirmed was the Klingon diplomatic equivalent of a standing ovation. From the Romulan neutral zone, there was silence. Sub-Commander Celine watched the transmission data and wrote a report that was considerably longer and considerably more uncertain than any report she had written in 11 years of intelligence work. She concluded it with a recommendation that the Tal Shiar reassess its operational assumptions regarding the Jedi Order, not because the Order had proven resistant to recruitment, but because the Order had proven to be something the Tal Shiar's frameworks had no category for: a collection of powerful individuals who were genuinely trying to be good, with the self-awareness to recognize when they were failing and the discipline to correct course before the failure became irreversible. She found this, professionally speaking, more unsettling than any threat. In the temple's deepest archive, Master Depa Balaba and Lieutenant Commander Data sat across from each other, surrounded by 17 active holographic displays and a shared enthusiasm for questions that didn't have answers yet. They had been working for 6 hours on a theoretical framework for force sensitivity in beings without midichlorians, a question that had begun as a scientific curiosity and had become, through the specific alchemy of genuine collaborative inquiry, something that felt like the edge of something important. Data had suggested 3 models. Balaba had refined 2 and discarded the third through force-assisted intuition that she couldn't fully articulate and Data couldn't fully quantify, which they had both decided was interesting rather than frustrating. The force responds to consciousness, Balaba said, for the 4th time, working through the implication from a new angle. Any consciousness, android consciousness included. Data processed this with the careful attention he gave to ideas that surprised him. "You are suggesting I may be force-sensitive. I am suggesting the force may be sensitive to you." She paused. "There is a difference." Data tilted his head at precisely 12 degrees. "That is," he said, "a distinction I will require considerable time to fully evaluate." "Good," Balaba said. "I have nowhere else to be." The treaty, formal, imperfect, full of compromise and deliberately unresolved questions and footnotes that 3 generations of Federation lawyers and Jedi scholars would spend considerable time arguing about, was signed 40 days later in the Hall of Concord, witnessed by Picard and Windu, and Yoda and President Jaresh Inyo and a Klingon observer who had insisted on attending and spent the ceremony standing in the back with his arms crossed in the specific posture that meant, in Klingon body language, profound approval. It established the Jedi Temple as a sovereign entity within Federation space, not a member world, not a Starfleet installation, but something the treaty called, in language that Picard had suggested and the Council had accepted. After 3 days of debate, a living institution, an entity whose authority derived not from territory or military capacity, but from the accumulated wisdom of its members and their relationship to the force that permeated the universe they now shared. The Consultative Council began meeting monthly. Its recommendations were not binding. They were, however, read carefully by every Federation world that had been paying attention, which, after Mundi's transmission and Picard's response, was most of them. Sora Bulk resigned from the Jedi Council and spent 6 months in solitary meditation before returning to active service as a diplomatic liaison to the Bajoran Spiritual Authority, a role that suited him in ways he hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain, which he eventually decided meant the Force had known something he hadn't. Section 31 did not dissolve. It adapted, as it always did, which remained a problem for another day. The Borg returned, as everyone had known they would, with a cube rather than a scout vessel, and a level of preparation that suggested the collective had spent considerable processing power on the problem of the Force. The battle that followed lasted 9 hours and generated 17 separate tactical innovations, 6 of which came from Jedi Masters and 11 of which came from LaForge and Data working in the Enterprise's engineering bay at a pace that suggested both officers had temporarily forgotten they needed to sleep. The cube retreated. The temple sustained structural damage to 2 outer spires. 23 Jedi Knights were injured. No one died, which Yoda later said was not luck. The Force, he said, had been listening. Picard logged all of it, the treaty, the battle, the slow and complicated, and genuinely unresolved process of 2 civilizations, learning to exist alongside each other, without either consuming the other, in the Enterprise's official record and in his own personal log, where he was more honest about the uncertainty that remained. He wrote, on the night after the treaty signing, "We have not solved anything. We have, I think, found a better way to keep trying, which is, if I am honest, the most any civilization has ever managed." He set down the PADD and looked out the observation port at the temple, gleaming in Federation space, ancient and present and irreversibly part of a universe that was no longer quite the same as it had been. He picked up his tea. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. In the end, neither the Jedi Order nor the United Federation of Planets emerged from their collision unchanged. The Federation gained something it had not known it lacked, a form of awareness that no sensor could replicate, a living conscience embedded in its diplomatic architecture, a reminder that the universe they explored was not merely matter and energy, but something older and more responsive than their science had imagined. The Jedi gained something equally essential, a civilization worth believing in again, imperfect, arguing with itself, slow to act and quicker to debate than any Jedi Council would have preferred, but genuinely trying, in the specific way that only beings capable of failure can try. The Force had brought them to this galaxy for reasons that Yoda never fully explained and that the Jedi Council debated for years afterward. Perhaps it was balance, the wild, untended energy of a universe learning, slowly, to be listened to. Perhaps it was simply that 10,000 people needed somewhere to be, and the universe, in its ancient and impersonal generosity, had provided. Whatever the reason, the stars looked different after. Not visibly, not in any way a sensor could measure, but to those who had learned, from the Jedi's presence, to listen for something beneath the readings, something older than warp drive and older than the Federation and older than the long, struggling history of beings trying to be better than their worst impulses. The difference was unmistakable. The Force was awake in this galaxy now, and it was paying attention.